a photograph of an ancient cloth had brought the scientists face to face with the impossible. Three-dimensional information was being discovered where it couldn't possibly exist. The artifact was the Shroud of Turin, and without a doubt it is the most picked at, probed, x-rayed, examined, revered, reviled, tested, studied, scanned, and photographed artifact in the world today. For those who are unfamiliar with this particular piece of cloth, it has long been revered as the object described in the Gospel according to John, chapter 20, verses 6 and 7. Referring to Peter, John wrote,
"He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. The cloth was folded up by itself, separate from the linen."
For over 100 years, researchers, historians, and scientists of every variety have attempted to determine if this linen cloth, tucked away in a cathedral in Turin, Italy, could actually be the one referred to, the burial shroud of Jesus Christ. In 1988 was both controversial and hotly disputed by experts in many fields.
The problem of dating a cloth, not only the shroud, but I think any cloth, any old cloth, is not easy to solve completely and definitely.
According to the professor, the idea of a medieval origin of the shroud leads to an impossible thesis. The forger would have had to find a man to crucify, flog him mercilessly, place him in a shroud, and then manufacture or simply wait for the image to somehow appear.
I think that is quite impossible, that what we cannot do today, it was very easy and during a medieval period.
150,000 man-hours and the work of dozens of scientific disciplines were challenged, actually brushed aside, by a single carbon-14 test. But the world was left with the same question. What created the image? And how do all of these latest scientific advances lead us to this particular artifact? What is there about the image that causes scientists to put their reputations and fortunes at risk?
The resurrection itself belongs to the spiritual world, and I don't think it is the business of physics to talk about it. However, the shroud itself and what made the image leads us to a mysterious gate which opens for us, and it lets us to see a completely different world, an extraordinary world with extraordinary laws.
What are those laws? And do they exist regardless of the age of the fabric? Is this purely a scientific squabble, or could it be there is something here that is far more important than the artifact itself? Is it possible that the energy and information now being detected is actually the information we need to help us overcome the problems we face today? Are the secrets of the universe, perhaps of all creation, locked up in this seemingly ordinary linen burial cloth? Can the image, now known to contain three-dimensional information, also be a quantum hologram?
In general relativity, we have found that there are certain things called black holes. Now, the surface of a black hole is called an event horizon. And it's called that because right at that surface, the laws of physics seem to change character drastically.
Isabel Pitzig, a particle physicist, believes the shroud has brought science to the threshold of a whole new understanding of physics. While dealing with the position of the body within the cloth, she discovered one of those mysterious properties that cannot be, yet somehow is. An interface that divides the image transport into two hermetically separate yet simultaneous actions and forces, causing the shroud to be taut and parallel on both sides, creating a true event horizon.
When you look at the image of the shroud, the two bodies next to each other, you feel that it's a flat image. But if you create, for instance, a three-dimensional object, as I did, the real body, then you realize that there is a strange dividing element, an interface, from which the image is projected up and the image is projected down. The muscles of the body are absolutely not crushed against the stone of the tomb. They are perfect. It means that the body is hovering between the two sides of the shroud. What does that mean? That there is absolutely no gravity. Other strange things you discover that the image is absolutely undistorted. Now, if you imagine that the cloth was wrinkled, tied, wrapped around the body, and all of a sudden you see a perfect image, which is impossible unless the shroud was made absolutely taut, rigidly taut. Everybody thinks that the tomb signifies death. Not at all, the exact opposite. The shroud and the tomb signifies an unbelievable beginning, because in the depth of the collapsed event horizon, there is something which science knows as singularity. This is exactly what started the universe in the Big Bang. We have nothing less in the tomb of Christ than the beginning of a new universe.
Some scientists believe the characteristics of the image on the shroud, such as three-dimensional information from a two-dimensional photograph, the negative aspect of the image, and the fact that the image that appears on the cloth virtually free of distortion, are basically holographic.
The quantum hologram is merely a method of describing the total emissions from an object. Very much like if you look at your fingertip and you look at one of the little swirls on your fingertip, it doesn't tell you very much about you. But if you look at the swirls on all 10 fingers all at once, that's your fingerprint, and it uniquely defines you and identifies you. The same thing with the quantum hologram. The emissions from a physical object, when studied as a whole, uniquely identify events in the history of that object.
Could it be that events in the history of the Shroud of Turin are still there for us to discover, decipher, and understand? If the essence of physical law is informational, then perhaps the image on the shroud has given us not only a record of the resurrection, but a description of creation as well. Could it be that instead of science proving the shroud is authentic, the image on the shroud is proving the accuracy of the science? In the quest for scientific authenticity, has the miraculous meaning of the shroud been rediscovered? What would it mean to the world if scientific research and the faith of generations could join hands in perfect harmony?
Fragments of Jesus' death certificate.
Il contenuto di queste scritte.
The contents of these words refer to the death of a person who's called Iesois Narsarenos, the name that we find lying in the four Gospels.
In 1978, a group of experts found some letters around the face shown by the shroud. Barbara Frail has now decoded them. The partial words are in 3 languages: Greek, Latin, and Aramaic. To understand what they mean, Barbara Frail has studied the Roman law of Palestine going back to the year 30 AD.
Un condannato a morte non poteva.
The body of a man sentenced to death could only be returned to the family after a year had gone by in a common grave, handled by a court in Jerusalem. After that 1 year, the body then could be returned to the family and go to the family tomb.
In the case of Jesus Christ, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus asked the governor Pontius Pilate not to leave the corpse in a common grave, but instead to use Joseph of Arimathea's family tomb.
Fu comunque necessario etichettare.
They still needed to tag the body because other members of Joseph Arimathea's family could be buried there. The deceased could not stay there long. After the 12 months, it had to be returned to relatives.
So once the body was wrapped in the shroud, strips of papyrus with large letters on it were placed on the head to make note of the person deceased.
c'era il nome del defunto, la data del...
The name of the deceased, the date, and the motive behind the death sentence was written on it, along with the date of when the body could be returned to the respective family.
That data coincides with what's in the Gospels. According to the expert, these strips of papyrus were glued to the shroud for centuries, and after various chemical reactions, some traces of ink were absorbed into the linen.
L'inchiostro con cui
The ink to write the words include some kind of metal, and there has been a chemical reaction with the cellulose of the linen and with the image on the shroud.
Barbara Frale wanted to prove her hypothesis and turned to a group of paleographers. Without telling them where the letters originated, they confirmed the letters were written in the 1st century at the time of Jesus.